I am James E. Williams, Jr., and I serve as a commissioner of the North Carolina Martin Luther King Jr. Commission. On behalf of the commission, I welcome you to this discussion this evening of Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham City jail. The Martin Luther King Jr. Commission works to encourage appropriate ceremonies and activities throughout the state relating to the observance of the legal holiday honoring Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. But not just that. It also works to promote among the people of North Carolina an awareness and appreciation of the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. At some point toward the end of 2022, our commission became aware that April 16 of 2023 would mark the 60-year anniversary of Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. That letter, in my opinion, belongs in the pantheon of this country's most important written documents. And this amazing letter deserves an amazing and esteemed panel. And I believe that's what we have brought to you this evening to discuss and reflect on the letter. And I also want to now introduce you to our esteemed moderator, Professor April Dawson. Professor Dawson is Associate Dean of Technology and Innovation and Professor of Law at North Carolina Central University's School of Law. She has taught a wide range of school classes, including constitutional law, administrative law, a Supreme Court seminar, and AI and the law. She is also co-host of the Legal Eagle Review radio show with her colleague, Irving Joyner. Professor Dawson, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Attorney Williams, and thank you all for joining us this evening. We are absolutely delighted to have you join in this discussion on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s seminal letter from Birmingham jail, where we will discuss its lessons, relevance, and today's call to action. We are going to hear from 4 brilliant and thoughtful panelists who I will introduce in a few minutes. If you have any questions, we encourage you to type them in the chat, and we'll have time later in the program to pose your questions to our panelists. So 60 years ago, on April 12th, 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested for participating in a nonviolent protest against racial segregation in Birmingham, Alabama, one of the most racially divided cities in the United States at the time. The protests were part of the Birmingham Campaign, which aimed to challenge segregation and the unjust treatment of Black citizens in Alabama. Dr. King, along with other civil rights leaders, organized demonstrations, sit-ins, marches to draw attention to the racial injustice present in Birmingham. However, the city had obtained a court injunction that prohibited the protest, and the local police force used this injunction as a basis to arrest those who continued to participate in the demonstrations. Dr. King decided to defy the injunction, believing it was unjust, and deliberately allowed himself to be arrested. This act of civil disobedience was part of his broader strategy to create tension and urgency around the issue of racial segregation, and to force the authorities to negotiate with civil rights leaders. 8 white religious leaders from Alabama published a statement in the Birmingham News the same day of Dr. King's arrest and called for an end to the protest. The white clergymen criticized the nonviolent protests, marches, and demonstrations, calling them unwise and untimely, and characterized Dr. King as an outsider. The white religious leaders argued in their letter that the fight against segregation and racial inequality should be conducted through the courts and legal system, not through protests and demonstrations. They appealed for patience and a slower, more measured approach to social change, believing that progress would eventually come without the need for disruptive protests. Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail, written on April 16, 1963, is a response to the white clergy statement and provided a powerful defense for the use of nonviolent civil disobedience as a necessary and moral response to racial injustice. Today, more than 6 decades later, his eloquent defense of nonviolent protests and his call for a united front against injustice continues to resonate with individuals and communities around the world. And today we're going to explore Dr. King's letter with our 4 esteemed panelists. Duke University and Howard University graduate, Dr. Rodney Sadler Jr., has dedicated time to teaching biblical and religious history. He is a published author who lectures within the church in his community, and he serves as a managing editor for the African American Devotional Bible. Dr. Sadler has worked with the Office of Black Church Studies at Duke University, and he is the director of the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation at the Union Presbyterian Seminary. Further, Dr. Sadler is a co-founder of the Reimagining American Project of Charlotte and a board member of that organization. Also a Duke University and an Emory University graduate, Dr. LaRonda Manigault Bryant serves as a prominent researcher focused on the discipline of religion, anthropology, art, music, media, and understanding how Black women engage religion and spirituality. Dr. Manigault Bryant serves as a Sonia Hayes Stone Director for Black Culture and History, and she founded the Conjure Girl Blue Productions. Serving as a spiritual writer, preacher, and community cultivator, Dr. Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove is the Assistant Director for Partnership and Fellowships at Yale University. He founded the Rutba House of Hospitality and the School for Conversion in Durham, North Carolina. Dr. Wilson Hartgrove is a published author and experienced lecturer who speaks often about spirituality and faith in public life. And a soon-to-be graduate and Moorhead Kane Scholar at UNC Chapel Hill, Greer Webb works diligently to advocate for marginalized communities, equity, and truth. He is the co-founder of the NC Town Hall and Young Americans Protests. In his sophomore year of college, he co-chaired the UNC Chapel Hill's Black Student Movement Political Action Committee. Greer served as the youngest member of the City of Raleigh's Police Advisory Board, and he currently serves on the North Carolina Governor's Crime Commission and is an intern for the Triangle Martin Luther King Jr. Committee. So I want to thank you all, our wonderful panelists, for your participation in tonight's program. So we have a lot to talk about, but first, I'd like for each of you to share your thoughts on why Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail is so important. And as you talk about the importance of it, if you can share why it resonates with you personally. So Dr. Sadler, we will start with you.
Thank you so very much, April. I am pleased to be able to be with you tonight. Thank you to James in particular for the invitation to be here. I love this letter from a Birmingham City Jail. I think he said it quite eloquently tonight when he said that this is one of the most significant masterpieces of the English uh, literary corpus in the US. In some respects, it is amazing because of its rhetorical power. Dr. King skillfully addresses his eight interlocutors in this letter and calls each of them out, brings each of them into this. If you remember, he was in a conversation with seven Christian ministers, bishops, Catholic, I think maybe a Presbyterian, I know Methodist, and then one Jewish rabbi in this conversation. And you can see strategic points where he touches on each of their identities and brings them in, talking about how he wants to stand with, he would have stood with the against the Holocaust, where he in Germany during the 1940s, talking about the nature of his affection for and affection for the church, and how it made him concerned about the moral virtues of its community to the Christian ministers. So rhetorically, it's remarkable. It is an amazing theological document as well, though being very, very light on biblical content, very light on deep theological thought. He touches on just enough to really prick a Christian heart. He really does move you to think about the necessity of working for justice if you believe in this Christian mission. If you believe in the Jesus movement, how could you not stand with him? If you think he's an extremist, then wouldn't Jesus, wouldn't Amos, wouldn't Thomas Jefferson also be considered extremist? He sort of brings that level of Christianity, and again, Thomas Jefferson, and he brings in this notion of American commonplaces as well. So it plays so very well to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, as well as these powerful commonplaces for the American people. In the midst of it all, I think he also offers one of the most effective critiques of the Christian church, not just at his time, but even today. Some of the things that he says about the Christian church, about us being, what did he say? Silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows, instead of being courageous and engaging in the issues of the day. His prophetic prediction of where we are today, that if the church does not take seriously its call to justice, it's going to become irrelevant, an irrelevant social club to that next generation of people. And as we watch the bursting on the scene of what we call the quote unquote nuns, i.e. people that believe in God but have no religious commitment to a faith community, he's been proven right in this regard as well. So it is a clarion call. I was with the Presbyterians. I'm not a Presbyterian, but I do play one on TV. I am a Baptist, actually, but I was at the General Assembly for the Presbyterian Church about 4 years ago, and I remember them lifting up this letter and saying that this should be included among the creeds of the Presbyterian Church, because it does speak to the state of the church in America in such an effective, eloquent, and efficient way. So for these and so many other reasons, I think that this is it is a piece of literature that we should all know. It is, there are pieces of this letter that speak so faithfully to the cause of justice that it should be memorized by us all. If I'm a Baptist, we used to talk about memorizing scripture. So the parts of this that should be memorized, and dare I say, this should be part of the scripture of the American resistance movement. This is part of the heart of what it is that we say we believe. His words are at least as eloquent as another one of my great heroes, Frederick Douglass's.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sadler. Dr. Manigault Bryant, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, there's so many things. I'm like, Dr. Sadler, yes, indeed. There are so many things to be said, but I want to be brief because I want us to have enough, as much time to engage with each other as we can. But I wanted to really just kind of ground when and where I enter into this letter. And so I went digging and I went digging into, in some ways, my own archive. But I first encountered a letter from a Birmingham jail in the fall of 1995. In the fall of 1995, as an undergraduate at Duke University, and there was a course that I took. I went and looked it up, right? I was like, what course was that? And it was called Workshop in Rhetoric. So it was my very first semester in college, and we were given a slate of books, including this one, which I still have, right? History of Our Time, Bill Chafe, and so what I thought would be really interesting is I was like, well, let me see how I was engaging the text at the time, because I do remember the impact, and I want to talk about that in just a moment. But I thought it might be interesting for you all to see just how, as an undergraduate, I marked the hell out of this. I mean, I wrote notes upon notes upon notes. There's this one that you can't decipher because my writing is terrible. It says, "Dear Lord," right? In terms of those, the critiques that King was rendering. And so I actually thought that as a great exercise, I just want to read some of the things that I underlined, just in sequence, to give you a sense of, and then I want to talk very briefly about the impact. So I'm literally reading them as they were underlined in the text. More basically, I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. You deplore the demonstrations taking place in Birmingham, but your statement, I am sorry to say, fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstration. In any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps: collection of the facts to determine whether injustices exist, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. We have gone through all of these steps in Birmingham. Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. Are you able to accept blows without retaliation? Just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, so must we see the need for nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. We have not made a single gain in civil rights without determined legal and nonviolent pressure. Freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressed. I have all kinds of asterisks by this one, right? It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well-timed in view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied. Let's see. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. Hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience. A law is unjust if it is inflicted on a minority that, as a result of being denied the right to vote, had no part in enacting or devising the law. Who can say that the legislature of Alabama would set up that state's segregation laws was democratically elected? And then there's a moment in here. There's a moment in here, and I'm going to read what I wrote on the side. Of course, there is nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. It was evidenced sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar on the ground that a higher moral law was at stake. It was practiced superbly by the early Christians who were willing to face hungry lions and the excruciating pain of chopping blocks rather than submit to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. To a degree, academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. I don't know right to the side. He got right. And so I'm just turning the pages, right? Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The yearning for freedom eventually manifests itself, and that is what has happened to the American Negro. Just page after page. I mean, I have underlined. It's not a very long essay in the larger scheme of things, even though he does say I've gone on about this very long. But I will just conclude my kind of reading to say, one day the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for what is best in the American dream and for the most sacred values of our Judeo-Christian heritage, thereby bringing our nation back to those great wells of democracy, which were dug deep by the founding fathers in their formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. So I read this when I was 17 years old. I started college when I was 17 years old. I still have this book from, 28 years ago? From 28 years ago, I still have this text. And, the impact for me just really spoke to the power of rhetoric to provoke action, right? It also, for me, it sowed the seeds of, clarity, and I think of conviction, what it means to actually convey with a compelling conviction what it is that you fundamentally believe, and to call others into accountability based on those beliefs. I mean, it was salient, yet it was scathing, right? It was, passionate, but it was precise. It was, oh my goodness, it was, I don't know, critical, but it was also cogent, right? So it had an impact on me, so much so that it was a text, and has been a text that I return to even later on as I've, helped to do some work around the archives of Wyatt T. Walker, right? Who was, King's kind of right hand in a lot of those ways. So I would just say that for me, that impact was intimate, reading in my very first courses in my very first year in college, and being spurred, the seeds were sown even then to always to have that unction, and to want and be willing to compel others to act.
Thank you so much, Dr. Manigault Bryant. And Dr. Wilson Hartgrove.
Well, let me just start by saying what a joy it is to gather around the text together. This is what happens in a classroom. You gather around the text, but man, to get to be together with people who've loved the text for years, not just read it once this week, but have loved it and been informed by it, it's a real gift. As for how I come to the text, just a few things. Well, one, I come as a preacher. I'm also a Baptist. Baptist called me to preach when I was 16 years old, so I've been at this for a while. And as a Baptist preacher, I come to the text just in awe of the strategic decision that Dr. King made to go to jail on Good Friday and to preach his Easter sermon from the jail cell. Because in that narrative that the church knows, you can put a man down on Friday, but Sunday's always coming, and so that is playing in the text, and the preacher has to recognize that. As an author, I have to admire. I mean, what everyone has said is absolutely true. I mean, this is a masterpiece of American letters, and as someone who has tried to craft words for years now and tried to set myself up so I could do my best, it's just beautiful to think about the production of this text. He wrote it out on the edges of the newspaper that the letter from the local preachers, he's doing this, on the edge of a little cot in a jail cell with limited resources. And I think it's a reminder that some of our best thinking, our best writing always comes in the midst of struggle. And when we come to the place where we know that our words have to have consequence, they have to speak to the moment, they have to address what's right there in front of us. So that comes to mind. And finally, I just wanted to say that I come to the text, of course, as someone who's been raised white in this country and who grew up in a church that was shaped by whiteness and by the distortions of whiteness. Both whiteness has distorted the way many American Christians see the world, and also the way we understand our Christianity. And so I come to this letter very much as one who receives it somewhat like the immediate addressees of the letter. It was written to these white clergy who thought they knew better, assumed they knew better, and thought they were doing good by informing this brother that he should do it differently. So I have to hear the letter that way and let it speak to me and speak to the hesitancies of whiteness that remain in me. and that tell me, they whisper in my ear. If you've been raised white in this culture, whiteness will always whisper in your ear and tell you, maybe there's a proper avenue through which we could pursue this so that it would come out and the system should work. And maybe you don't have to raise your voice. Maybe you don't have to be that radical, that extreme. That voice is always there. And I have to listen to Dr. King push back with deep, deep love. I'll just close by saying, I thought of this letter and the conclusion of this letter when I was out in Nashville a few weeks ago and heard Brother Justin Jones, who is a dear brother, and I've known him since he was an undergrad at Fisk University. But the most beautiful moment of that whole thing was when he looked at those people who he knew they were going to vote him out of that house. And he said, when I stood up to interrupt your procedure, I did it for your children too. I thought that's beautiful. That's King's spirit. That's right there from the letter. He's internalized that. He embodied it. And in so many ways, we've got to do the same. So those are the thoughts I bring.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson Hartgrove. And our next generation representative, Greer Webb, Dr. Sadler mentioned how King was kind of hearkening to that next generation. And we are absolutely delighted that you're able to join the panel. What are your thoughts?
Well, thank you, Professor Dawson. It is a pleasure to be here. Good evening to everyone. And I will try and be brief also as I close out this question and my response to it. I'm 22 years old and I had the opportunity to be part of a program. I'm back in April. It is now May 1st. So I guess not that long ago, but a few weeks ago on the 60th anniversary of the submission of this letter, the publishing of this letter, to take part in an event that really centered around, again, the context as we've been discussing, and I'll try not to reiterate what's already been said, but it was so powerful and poignant to me to be able to read the letter from a young person's perspective, from a young Black man's perspective, and to see myself in that letter, meaning I see Dr. King almost like you said, Professor Dawson, hearkening to that next generation. What type of future, what type of reality are we creating or leaving for our next generation? And those weren't just the Black children that were being disenfranchised and continue to be disenfranchised by our systems of inequity, but also white children, also people who want a chance, young women, to be equal, right? And to have the same types of opportunities as their white male counterparts. So I think it's very important that we're having this conversation. So definitely want to shout out the North Carolina Department of Administration and the North Carolina Martin Luther King Jr. Commission. But again, going back to my responses to this letter, I have three. One, I think Dr. Wilson Hartgrove really left off where I wanted to begin, which was I immediately thought back in April of the Tennessee Three, when all of this was going on, and raising your voice for not only positive change, but sometimes being disruptive or what's seen as disruptive in the name of equity and justice. I had the opportunity to attend the North Carolina Black Summit this past weekend, where Representative Justin Pearson was the keynote speaker. And he really delivered and really shouted out not only Black women, and we do need to shout out the Black women of the civil rights movement and those who allowed folks like Martin Luther King Jr. to continue, folks like Ella Baker. I'm from Raleigh, so that history of SNCC and Shaw University is so clear throughout so much of the organizing of the civil rights movement. But he shouted out not only Black women, but those his mentors, Black folks who poured into him. And we know that it's tough to continue to do this justice work. And so for me, I immediately thought that change, and you mentioned this, Dr. Wilson Hartgrove, about how Dr. King wrote this letter in the margins of the newspaper. I say all the time that change is best made in the margins. And literally in this case, we see how marginal it is. And so I think it's the whole letter is a response in and of itself of civil disobedience. I mean, we think, right, of the sit-in movement and of protesting and interruption, but this letter was a piece of civil disobedience. And you mentioned, Dr. Sadler, the Christians and the other founders of this country who were mentioned by Dr. King in the letter. He also mentioned Abraham Lincoln, right, a president, and Paul Bunyan, and these people who went to the depths, right, to the end for what they believed and what was necessary for them to pursue their passion. And so I think that as a AAAD African American and diaspora studies major at UNC, as well as political science, I think I have to read this through a critical lens, through a youth-centric lens, and just noting that the time is always right to do what is right, which is another phrase that Dr. King coined in a speech in 1968 called a proper sense of priorities. And so I think it's very, very key that when you read this letter, and it's already been mentioned, but kind of addressing the white moderates, addressing white Christians, addressing the idea of Christianity in general, and how loving our neighbor, loving our brothers and sisters is key and should be held near and dear to the hearts of all those who profess to be Christians. I think it's very important to note that it is our moral responsibility to even sometimes break laws in the name of what's right, instead of waiting for justice to just come, waiting passively, whether that's through the courts or through policy. And so I'll wrap up by saying I have, when I'm speaking with other young people, what I call the big three, which is actually inspired by Dr. King. The big three is almost an equation for lasting change. The first step is education. The second variable is protest. And the third is written policy change. And all three of those things are addressed in this letter. Of course, it is an educational letter. That's been mentioned already. And so many people that I've talked to recently, especially in this renewed age of social justice and civil rights history study, have understood this letter as a way of educating them on what they need to do to pursue and achieve justice, to participate in justice. It's also a letter of protest, as I mentioned, of civil disobedience. And then it is also chock full of suggestions for policy change, for the written changes that need to be, and not even changes, but just that America itself as a nation would live into those original words and documents, right? I think that's very poignant and necessary to point out as well, that Dr. King kind of hits all of the areas necessary to achieve and sustain change in this letter from Birmingham Jail. So on its 60th year anniversary, I'm just proud to be here and very excited for our conversation and ready to dive into more of these questions and really understand what my role is as a rising leader, as someone who is around young people all the time. What does the next 10, 15, 20 years look like? And how can we make sure that we don't repeat what caused this letter to be written by Dr. King?
Thank you, Mr. Webb. And I appreciate your point about reading the letter through a youth-centric lens. And as you were talking about your perspective as one of the more junior in terms of age, but not in terms of spirit on this panel, I'm always reflecting on how young Dr. King was, right? And so he was in his early 30s. And so when we think about what he was able to accomplish in such a short time period, it is helpful to consider what was going on that led to the Birmingham campaign. And so I was able to give just a little bit of context to the letter itself, but it may be helpful as we think about where he was at that stage in his journey, what was going on historically, or what was going on within that moment. And so, Dr. Sadler, can you provide some additional historical context to the circumstances that led to King writing that letter in 1963?
Thank you for that question, April. I think that this was in the midst of a growing movement, as there had been some success. We'd seen the success of the Montgomery campaign. We've seen that the movement had begun to take on some significant progress. It was probably also in the midst of intense pressure from many different perspectives, i.e., he mentions even in this letter that there were many people within the Black church that were more accommodationist in their response, and they were intentionally trying to move away from Dr. King in the ways that he was moving in a much more activist stance. And he stands in the middle between them and emerging nascent Black nationalism. So this notion of emerging Black nationalism, which is coming to the fore and beginning to have a much more powerful impact with people like Elijah Muhammad, at this point in time, Malcolm X becomes a dominant figure on the scene as well. I don't remember what this relationship between their meeting and their agreement to try to work together, but I believe this is even before that they had that classic meeting as well. So this is in a period of significant possibility, yet great resistance. One of the things I always like to think about when I think about the civil rights movement is think about it in the context of our own efforts for justice today. The Moral Monday movement, Jonathan can tell you a great deal about that, in the Poor People's Campaign, the Black Lives Matter movement. We engage in these movements today, knowing that we've got people on the Supreme Court, people in the local state courts, people in both houses of representatives and Congress that look like us, that resemble us in some way, that might have our issues and concerns at heart. When he does this, when King engages in this work, there's nobody there that looks like him. There's nobody there that really has his way of thinking in, that he can rely on. I can turn to this in this direction. This is before people, I guess you had Adam Clayton Powell, but this is before even John Conyers comes into Congress. So he's doing this movement with a great lack of certainty that there will be affable figures listening to him for support. So the context in which he does this is a context in which hope is a silly thing to have. Why would you have hope that things could change when everything is arrayed against you? Yet and still, he maintains hope that things will change. Yet and still, he maintains hope that the world will see the value of his moral position, and in the end, he's proven right, as people do react to the truth that he tells. And one other thing I'll say is that I often think about the whole civil rights movement as a reaction to Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited, and the call in that text for truth. The civil rights movement really was an effort to show this is what it looks like to be Black in the South. This is what it looks like, and this is why we've got to do something about the injustice. That desire to stand up and tell truth. In part, I think that America was better situated to deal with issues of truth in that day than, unfortunately, we are today. So the context might have been somewhat more favorable because we've given up on the truth, it seems like, in our own current context, and we've traded the truth for lies about, critical race theory and other things like that we've made boogeymen out of. But so it was in a very different context, yet in some ways very similar to the one in which we live today.
Thank you, Dr. Sadler. And as you were talking about, Dr. King noting the Black moderates, the accommodationists, it made me think about how, we have this revisionist history. And at the time of Dr. King's death, he was not a popular figure, right? And so when we think about what he did, it's so important that we understand our history. And to your point about deliberate efforts to erase our history, to not let the truth be known and studied and learned from, understanding the full magistry of Dr. King is important to understand his fight and his mission and his vision. But you can't do that if you whitewash him, if you narrow and boil him down to one single speech. Dr. Manigault Bryant, so as we think about Dr. King's emphasis on nonviolent resistance, right? He talks about that so eloquently in the letter. He talks about, he would not have thought that nonviolence would engender the phrase extremism, but then he embraces it and says, yes, I am extreme then. Can you talk about his philosophy of nonviolence and how we can take that philosophy into today's continuous fight? And so again, when we talk about this effort to suppress the history and to continue to marginalize groups, how can we take Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolence and apply it today?
Oh, that's a really great question. It's a really tough question. It's a tough question because I also understand, why the Black Panthers, many of them also wanted to take up arms, right? So you're asking me that question. I'm like, all right, it's an important question because I think it reinforces the notion that there are we must have multiple responses Right. Even as the particular response of nonviolence is a specific one that was utilized and utilized in particular ways, and I would say utilized in highly effective ways. They were also very strategic about how it was utilized. And just to go back to something that Dr. Sadler just said, um, in referencing Howard Thurman and Jesus and the Disinherited, I think it's really important to just, and making sure that the history is known. I think it's important that we know and recall where King was getting a lot of that information from. And he was getting it from Howard Thurman, right? Who, with Sue Bailey Thurman in, I think, 1935 or 1936, had gone to visit Gandhi and had been talking about the importance of what they would say the Negro story is and how it would be the mechanism to provoke liberation for all people, right? And so if King was at BU from 1951 or 52 to 55, he was right there when Howard Thurman was the dean of the chapel, and I think that started in about 1953, and a student of Howard Thurman. So I just wanted, also lift up again the name of Howard Thurman and Sue Bailey Thurman, right? In terms of the ways that a lot of that moment becomes highly masculinist in its, kind of contemporary representation. I want to, just kind of lift that up too. But, to the question of nonviolence, I would also say, we are in this very interesting moment. I think people who are familiar with history recognize that it is a cycle. It is a recurring manifestation of something that has long been in existence, that sometimes seems or lies more dormant than it might in this moment, right, where it feels particularly heightened. And we can think about the legislative actions among and across many states that is happening right now, right, in terms of legislation to promote a singular narrative of American history that is simply disingenuous, that is simply untrue, right? And are using all of the political and economic resources to purport a very problematic and erroneous message. So I would say that, King's message of nonviolence is absolutely appropriate for reminding us of the stakes of what actually inaction means, right? And so the beauty of nonviolence, particularly in the way that King and so many members of and activists in the civil rights movement, and even into now, right, utilize, is that they're not necessarily responding by using physical, like bodily, quote unquote, response. But if you know nonviolence, you also know that it is also a bodily response. To stand still in the face of all kinds of tumult and all kinds of threat to one's physical self actually does require a physical exertion of its own and mental exertion of its own and psychological sturdiness, I would argue. And so I think that those are also the messages that we continue to get from King's support and, very broad application of nonviolent resistance. And I think that is something that we need to utilize in as many of the diverse ways as possible. Sometimes that is literally sitting down. Sometimes that's standing up and not saying a thing. Sometimes it's just being present. Sometimes it's witnessing. So there are all kinds of mechanisms and criteria and characteristics of nonviolent resistance that we should also be utilizing and engaging. And I think becomes a roadmap, a lesson plan, if you want to think about it that way, for the things that we can do in this contemporary moment as well.
Thank you, Dr. Manigault Bryant. Dr. Wilson Hartgrove, you talked about this in your opening remarks in terms of being a white individual and reading Dr. King's letter to help temper what may be kind of automatic responses to protests, if you will. And you also have been very involved in, you don't just think about, you don't just think in a progressive way, you engage in progressive action. So nonviolent resistance, you don't just support it, but you engage in it as well. Can you talk about your support and the way your support shows up? And as you talk about that, can you talk about the importance of allyship and what that really means? When is it effective and when is it less effective?
Well, thank you. I hear this term allyship, and I think it makes sense that, when people are suffering anything, it makes sense for people to look to people around them and say, aren't you going to do anything? Are you going to let them do this to me? That's a fair question. And I have been in that situation and have found Dr. King to be quite helpful. One that comes to mind is years ago in this state, when the state of North Carolina was executing someone about every week, I joined folks who said, just as human beings, we don't believe that the state knows enough to end another human being's life. Among many other things, we know now that about 1 in 10 people who've been on America's death rows were actually not guilty of what they had been put there for. DNA evidence has made this clear. So as being part of that, I was arrested several times and had to go to court. And when I was on the stand, it was fascinating. In Raleigh, North Carolina, as a guy who was raised Baptist and became a preacher early on in my life, I got up on the stand and I swore on the Bible that I would tell the truth. And the judge said to me, how do you read Romans 13? Now, if you're not a Bible person, that might not be familiar to you, but Romans 13 is where St. Paul says to submit to the earthly authorities. And I just immediately, because of the help of Dr. King, was able to say, well, I read it the way Dr. King read it, that we submit to laws that we believe are wrong by breaking them and bringing them into the court. I said, I'm here before you, Your Honor, to try to raise the justice of this law. So sure, all of us, I think, as human beings, as people of faith, as people of conscience, can be called to be allies. But the additional thing I want to say is that in the struggle for justice in this country, as someone who was raised white, I have had to come to understand that this is my struggle too. Racial segregation and Jim Crow in the past, but the forms of it that we have now of disparity and racial injustice, that is incredibly dehumanizing to Black people, but it also dehumanizes anybody who believes in it, anybody who gets caught up in it, any human being who participates in a system that says some people, just by the color of their skin, are here and some people are here. And so actually my friend Bob Zellner, who was in SNCC, told me years ago that was his realization. That's when he decided he had to be in the movement for life. He said when he realized as a white person in Alabama, he wasn't free to go wherever he wanted to, because the same segregation laws that said Black and white folks couldn't be together there also meant he couldn't be there. So anyway, all that to say that I think allyship is important, but also just recognizing the way this impacts all of us, and that as Dr. King says, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I think that's something that we have to take seriously.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson Hartgrove. And that's a perfect segue into the next question for Mr. Webb, which is a statement that Dr. King makes very early in his letter, which is injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Can you share your thoughts on that very poignant statement, and how do you bring that forward as you engage in social justice activities today?
I think that's a great question. Thank you so much, Professor Dawson. I think we hear that phrase a lot, especially come January, right? Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And then when you see and you read the sentence before that in the letter, it says that, moreover, I'm cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. And then when you read the sentence afterward, it says we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I mean, that's just, again, that rhetoric, that penmanship, but more so that thinking, that intelligence, that vision to be able to say we are all connected. And it's so obvious and evident, yet we have been so engulfed in these power structures then, and we see those continuing now, that folks get shifted away from and become distracted from the reality that is our interconnectedness, not only as people, but as, you know, even subgroups of people, as men and as folks who are religious, and as women and people of color. We all have something that binds us together, and that's that we're human beings, right? We have a passion and want to be loved and to love and to be protected and to protect those around us and to thrive, right? And to sustain ourselves as we go throughout daily life. And so I think when you consider that particular quotation, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, it pops up in so much, if not all of the work that I do. I became active, I like to say, after the Parkland school shooting in 2018, when I was a junior in high school, and got or became moved to what my pastor calls holy discontent, right? Or righteous anger, or moral indignation, as it's also called. And I knew I had to do something. So I worked with young people, and I wanted it to be a collaborative effort. And so high schoolers around Wake County came together, and this was during the time of the walkout movement. And then we held a specific event at my high school, Sanderson High School. Jesse O. Sanderson was actually a segregationist, oddly enough, who did not want the merging of Wake County schools and Raleigh City schools here in North Carolina to occur because of the racial mixing that would be the byproduct. And so to even work and live and learn within that reality has been something that I've really kind of worked through since graduating high school. But my peers and I put on one event, and then we said, no, we have to do more. So that's where this idea for Young Americans Protest came from, and so, or out of. And so what we do now is we connect young people across North Carolina to the political structures in which they live, or where they work, or where they learn. And so I see it all the time, you know, injustices in one part of the state or in one part of the country, and young people crying out and not really feeling that support. And so my message is, look, all of these issues affect all of us equally, even though there is something to be said for those who are most directly impacted. We should all care the same amount about having that injustice righted. But maybe we don't all feel the same, immediate impacts, but it's on all of us to work together. And I think it's on young people in particular, as we've seen with the Tennessee Three, with the Parkland activists and others. I mean, we see how tough and difficult it is to work together and to personalize political issues, as I say, because even in the past 5 years since Parkland, I can't even name, all of the mass school shootings that have occurred and acts of violence that have been committed against young people and those of color. And so I think for us to really make this plain, injustice anywhere means that we're all, until we root out injustice and inequity, we are all very, very much vulnerable, to those injustices. It could happen to you at any moment. And that's something that I see often, and I think is helpful, especially when young people discuss these issues, is yes, we do consider the future. And I like to say that young people are those who will be impacted by policies, the laws that are enacted by the longest amount of time, because we're going to live longer. But there's something to be said for the now. Right. And making it so plain, as Dr. Sadler was, I believe, alluding to earlier, the ways in which, yes, maybe our racial dynamics and our representation in political spaces has changed, but there's still this undercurrent of moderation, right? Or I don't want to, rock the boat. And so to say, well, this could have been your child who was killed in a church in a bombing, as was the case for the young girls in Birmingham, or Parkland school shooting, those could have been, your brothers or sisters. You should want to do something about it. Or this environmental justice issue. North Carolina is home, many don't know, to the environmental justice movement. It started in Warren County right here, and now it's spread across the United States and across the world. So to be able to say all of these issues are connected, we're all connected. I think young people have a specific charge to make these issues plain and to continue to carry Dr. King's mantle forward. I think it's very clear that when he says, I'm in Atlanta, but Birmingham matters, and then everything after that is tied together, I think it's powerful. And I think it's pretty clear and evident in what he's saying, that we should all care to the same degree about equality and justice, even if the individual issues do affect certain communities, maybe more severely than others.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Webb. And all of you have commented on how eloquent Dr. King expresses himself in this letter. And can you talk about the impact that the style had on you. And Dr. Sadler, I'm going to have you begin, because each of you, as you're talking about this letter and how it has impacted you, it's clear that it made an impression, that it has touched you in your soul. And part of that is because of the mastery of the writing, the way he was able to use words and rhetoric and this incredibly eloquent writing style. So Dr. Sadler, can you start us off by sharing your thoughts on the writing style and how it has impacted you?
Well, thank you for that question. And again, I just want to say thank you to each and every one of these panel members before just listening to you all talk about the way it impacted you, Greer, just listening to the way that you've talked about it impacting someone in this next generation going forward. It lets me know that it continues to have that sort of dynamic rhetorical impact on the community. I have to admit that there are lines in this sermon, I call it, this letter that I couldn't preach if I wasn't able to grasp onto. Progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability, but comes about by the persistent efforts and hard work of those willing to be co-workers with God. This punctuates so many sermons for me to think about some of the things that he says about the inescapable network of mutuality. I think he's done such a remarkable job here of capturing the angst of the African-American community, the tenuous moral nature of the larger white church context, and the necessity for immediate change, the necessity of making some shifts right now. Another title to a book, Why We Can't Wait. It's Why We Can't Wait is evident in the midst of this letter as he talks about the necessity of those who have been oppressed to have the yoke broken in this moment and not wait for some other time that, as he said, usually means never. So the way that this is written, the care that he did, and you got to remember, this guy is writing this. Jonathan was aptly saying, he's writing this and I've heard that some of this is on the newspaper, some of this is on toilet paper, some of this is on scraps of paper snuck in to him, that he's putting this together. I can't remember, who do I want to quote? Whose quotes do I want to pull? He's bringing this all together and then talking about quotes from the Bible, from Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Runyon, in prison. So there's something about his own style too. I've heard many people say that he had what did we call a photographic memory, so he could bring all of these pieces together. So I imagine that with King, his photographic memory tied to this rich tradition of being a fourth generation Baptist preacher, and then brought together with the exigencies of the moment in which he found himself, really did enliven this letter, enliven all of his rhetoric in general, but this letter in particular, and made it stand out. Because of this letter, so many of us today are able to find a way to say something that is utterly complex in a way that grabs people's attention. And this is what he's doing. He's making a very complex sociological analysis in a very folksy and engageable way. Ultimately, he's having a conversation as though he's talking with friends with whom imagine having a conversation with a friend with whom you disagree on a subtle matter. He's making this bond between he and these other clergy people. And almost like Ta-Nehisi Coates does in this book, Between the World and Me, writing, I'm going to pretend I'm writing to my son, and I'm writing to the world. King, I'm going to pretend I'm writing just to you 8 folks, my friends, and I'm indeed writing to a larger world outside. So the whole ability of him to weave this together in such an elaborate way has made this letter all the more powerful. I'll shut up now, but you've got me excited just thinking about it. This is a letter that preaches.
Thank you, Dr. Sadler. Dr. Manigault Bryant.
Yeah, this letter, in terms of its eloquence, in terms of its, rhetorical style. Remember, I first came to this letter in a class on rhetoric, right? And I, said in my opening remarks about, I spoke to how this letter really speaks to the power of rhetoric to provoke action, right? And so there are a lot of things that are happening in a stylized sense. But if there's anything that I, kind of take away from this letter, it is, one of the things that I try to emulate as a communicator that, there's this great, kind of analogy that there's no more victorious a moment than when you have delivered, something, information, an idea in a way that is profound but engaging because it's easy to access, right? But also when you have rendered a scathing critique that is so provocative that people don't even realize that you have ripped their heads off. And so there is something that is so utterly powerful. And it is something that I honestly, people who know me will know. I love to write a good letter. And it is for these very reasons I try to implement and deploy a lot of those strategies of actually speaking truth to power in a really clear and concise, but also convincing way. And doing that when necessary in a way that is really going to spurn people to do something, to react in some way. And so I think that that's a really important takeaway for me in terms of the kind of stylistic part of the letter. Yes, it's beautiful. And yes, it is wonderfully stylized. And it is very sermonic. But it's also quite scathing and it is meant to provoke. It really is. And so I am notorious for writing a scathing letter. As folks who've been on the other end of my emails, they know it is scathing in that form. And the other thing that I would just say is part of the eloquence of the letter and how we respond to it. I think, Dr. Sadler, you touched on it just for a glimpse. You gave us a glimpse of it. I think it is important to remember that even though he was in Birmingham jail, he literally wasn't alone, right? And so the writing and the provocation and the impetus of this letter comes not from a place of complete solitude, but solidarity, right? And so would we have the letter, by all the reports, without Wyatt T. Walker having transcribed his scribbled handwriting, right? Would we have, a lot of the support that, King had when we think about his inner circle and who he was working with, from Hosea Williams, all of these people, right? So in Ella Baker, it is so important to know that this kind of critique comes with refining, it comes from experience, but it also comes in community, right? And so I think that is an important part of my own experience and my own encounter of the letter. And yes, Dr. Sadler, to your comment, it was sweet but whipping. It sure was.
Could I riff on that a little bit? Because you made me think of something I thought of when Greer was talking earlier. That so you're talking about how he's writing, but I also want to talk about how, in terms of the action that the letter is written as a part of, King is very much engaged in a community that is learning. And on both the front and the back end of this experience, he's actually learning from young people. I think that's really important. People younger than him. He wasn't that old, but people younger than him. So the sort of escalation of the direct action in Birmingham is very much based on what SCLC was learning from SNCC at the time. So SNCC is the student, young people organization, as you mentioned, founded at Shaw University here in North Carolina, because the brilliant Ella Baker, all spring, while the sit-ins were happening in 1960, is clipping newspapers. This is before the internet. This is before, you can get on Twitter and DM somebody. This is Ella Baker clipping newspapers, looking at which school the people who were arrested were reported as being students at. And then she sent an invitation to that school asking them to send a delegation to this meeting that happened Easter weekend of 1960. So here's a student movement that has begun taking direct action, putting nonviolence into practice to directly confront the systems of Jim Crow segregation. And the next year, they're doing the Freedom Rides. They come through Atlanta on the Freedom Ride. They try to get Dr. King to get on the bus with them, and he says, "No, I can't quite get there yet." So these are people who are pushing him, and that's sort of on the front end of it. Now, on the back end, he goes to jail. He writes the letter. He does get out early the next week, and in the midst of the Birmingham campaign, the reality that King has to face is that he has taken this, big step. He's gone to jail. He's written the letter, but it hasn't gotten out that far yet. And he still hasn't broken through, right? The movement still hasn't broken through. So the historians tell us that what does create the breakthrough is when Jim Bevel comes to him and says, the children want to march, right? So now kids who have seen their parents going to these mass meetings, kids who've seen what's happening, they want to march. And as we all know now, when they do march, Bull Connor and the local law enforcement shoot them down with fire hoses. They sick dogs on them. That's the image that goes around the world, and that really shifts the consensus of the country in terms of what is happening here is immoral. What is happening is wrong. It has to be changed. It has to be challenged. And it ultimately convinces some of the business leaders and others there in Birmingham to come to the table and to negotiate. But I think it's fascinating how, in terms of the action that that King is engaged in with writing this letter, he's learning the whole time. He's learning beforehand. He's being pushed. He's taking this into his body. He's engaging in new experiences. And his writing is sort of bringing everything that he knew as a scholar, as a preacher, as someone who was very well trained, but who was having to learn on the fly, as we always do. What does this situation demand of me, demand of us right now? And that's in conversation with lots of people, including young people who were teaching him all the way.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson Hartgrove. And Mr. Webb.
Man, he just set it up perfectly for me again. I appreciate that, Dr. Wilson Hartgrove. I mean, you are right on the money, as you all have been all night. And again, I'll try and kind of keep my concluding comments on this point brief, because I do want to get to some of the audience questions and make sure we do wrap up on time. But I just have to say, I was thinking as a young person, you mentioned Ella Baker, the overlooked mother of the civil rights movement, as she's called, who helped found SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And for those of you on the call who might be on social media, I was just writing down as you were speaking, Dr. Wilson Hartgrove, I feel like Ella Baker was saving TikToks while the government was doxing people back during that time, because doxing, for those who may not know, is publishing identifying information about individuals. And I feel like Ella Baker was clipping, and she was starting to form this group of students, of young people who could use their power that was being exposed and that they were being arrested for by the government, to really go and actually start to alter at a systemic level what it means to be served as a Black person in the United States, what it means to be a leader, what it means to have the same political power and access as white folks did during that time. So I really see her as a mastermind in so many ways. I think one kind of wrap up point for me, pulling straight from the letter, is something that I mentioned at the event in April that was held in Chapel Hill at the Chapel Hill Public Library, where we really dissected this letter, and young people again were at the center of that, which I think is so necessary. And it's found in the part of the letter where it just reads that Dr. King writes, the goal of America is freedom. And the question I posed to the crowd there in April in Chapel Hill was, is it? Is the goal of America actually freedom? And what I think he was doing there was putting a spin on what is called a legal fiction. The Declaration of Independence is a legal fiction. The original Constitution of the United States is a legal fiction. What does that mean? It means that the founders, the white men who were writing those documents, didn't believe in the words that they were putting on the paper. They owned enslaved people, but yet all men were created equal. So I think what Dr. King is doing here is challenging us to say the ultimate goal of America should be freedom. And it's not, which is why I've just laid out this cause for why we should demand it and push for it every day until we get it. I think it's very interesting also to think about this idea of acting now, right? These systems are in place. I think the ideas are in place. Young people, we know by now, we don't only protest and yell, and we're not lazy. We actually participate and have ideas. And so now is really the time to put some of our passions and some of our policies into practice. It's time to turn our practices into policies rather, and it's time to actually pass some laws and invest in communities who have been marginalized throughout centuries here in the United States. The time literally is now. We have ideas about how to reduce gun and gang violence. We have ideas about how to close the racial wealth gap. We have ideas about what it looks like to give everyone equal access to healthcare and to increase financial literacy, to close the achievement gap when it comes to schooling. I mean, all of these ideas are here. So what it's going to take is an intergenerational push, I believe, toward the future. But the way to do that is to make these small systemic steps now. And that will lead us down this path of equity and justice. And so I think, again, closing with that idea of the big three, education plus protesting plus policy change, is one way we can all think about our role in this freedom or justice movement. And then I'll leave you with this acronym, CAN. We can do it, C-A-N, conversation. You know, it all begins with a conversation like the one we're having tonight. I know the Secretary of the North Carolina Department of Administration was on here earlier, and I think is still on here. So we appreciate this space, and I appreciate people in positions of power in this state understanding their role in championing these conversations. So that's the C, can. A, admission. We have to admit our guilt as a nation, as a people. We have to admit our shortcomings as individuals, and we have to be humble. We have to remain humble and know that there is so much we don't know. There are people's stories and experiences we haven't learned yet. And then the N in can is next. You know, what we have to do now is everything we can to prepare for what's next. And so what that means is reflecting on our history, but then beginning to put into practice, as I mentioned, implementation, really, these ideas that more seasoned adults have, that young people have, that men, women, and other folks have about what it means to support one another and allow us all to thrive in the communities in which we all live. So I think those are kind of my takeaways from this letter, and its relevance to today is that we can do it. It's going to take these conversations. It's going to take admitting we don't always know everything, and it's going to take a focus on the next while practicing in the now.
All right. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Webb. All of you, the chat box has been, we've got some finger snappings and some fist bumpings, and we've got some questions. So we're going to, let's see, I've got a couple of questions here, and whoever wants to answer it, you can just jump in. So the first question is, what was the immediate response to the publication of this letter? Was there negotiation with the white clergy Dr. King addressed? Any thoughts?
I think it's fair to say that there was not any immediate repentance. I think some of them came along a bit as the city turned, but no, they didn't reply by saying, thanks, you're right.
Yeah, I really was going through my head to try to remember if there was a response that they ever gave to it. I've heard stories of some of these people at different points in time coming to different decisions and actually taking rather courageous stands in the aftermath of it, but not in the immediate aftermath. And never as a collective group did they stand up and say, let's give it a chance, let's have a negotiation, let's have a meeting. And I think that this is one of those points of concern for the contemporary church. How are we replicating the if not complicity, the complacency that we saw evident in that time period? When we sit on the sidelines, when we see what's going on with Black Lives Matter and we don't do anything about it, when we sit on the sidelines, when we see what's going on in places like Texas, hopefully not North Carolina, Florida, with the pushback against critical race theory, and say nothing about this. Why isn't the larger church, and I mean particularly the larger white church, standing up with a bold voice and saying, this is something wrong, this is not just, and if we believe we stand with and for God, we have to say something about this?
I think I'm dating myself in this way, but I always ask this question, like when you're playing games or like if you have a game night, or if someone asks you questions like, oh, what did we do before we had like our phones, we could look things up? I was like, we lied. We lied, or but my memory does. Am I? Is there somebody who can fact that
You're
check
right.
this for me? I do feel like it was like 50 years later. There was finally like some. Am I making this up?
No,
Is
you're
this
right.
just like?
You're right. There was a group of churches that got together in Birmingham on the 50th anniversary, church leaders. I know Jim Wallace was involved in organizing. It was, white
Yeah.
folks, but who've tried to learn from the movement. And yeah, they tried to sort of offer a reply, but it was not the people who were directly addressed. It was
Sure.
people
Sure.
who 50 years later saw that there should have been a reply from predominantly white churches.
Yeah, well, this letter, every time I read it, which, probably isn't often enough, right? Because, I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to be in conversation with you all, because it gave me yet another opportunity to reread and engage the text again. And it's just like any good thing that you have the opportunity to savor. Something new, is revealed every single time. And, I think that people didn't respond because if we go to, many church colloquialisms, somebody would say, you can't say amen, you say ouch, right? I mean, I think, the provocation was simply too great. I mean, the stakes feel, I think, to many, not just white folks, I mean, but the stakes feel really high. And so when you're talking about liberation, there's always the understanding that someone is going to have to give something up. And until people are willing to reconcile what it is that they have to give up, the power that they have to yield, or the economic resources, or the capital, or whatever it is, right? The commodity, the comfort, whatever it is that they have to give up, there's always going to be genuinely tepid response to this kind of provocation, because it is really, really homing in on the necessity to give something up. And that something is, a complete support of white supremacy for the ways that people, benefit from all of its deadly tentacles.
Preach.
All right.
Can I respond to something you said, Greer? Because I think this challenge that Dr. Manigault Bryant is articulating is one we have to take seriously in this moment. And what you said is that, if the legacy of white supremacy, if the legacy of, inequality in this country is going to be addressed, it's going to take policy. And there are policies that most Americans want, most North Carolinians want right now: increased wages, access to health care, common sense gun laws. We could go down the list. There are many things that if you survey people, most people want them, and we cannot get them. And we need to be clear about why. Because people with a lot of money have taken over our government in North Carolina. And there has been a pro-democracy movement in this state that has been trying to expand democracy to include all of those voices that want something else. And folks keep pouring money against it. So let's just be real. The Supreme Court of this state just acted last Friday to strike down decisions that had made gerrymandered maps illegal, that had made restrictive voter ID illegal, and that had opened access for formerly incarcerated people to be restored their franchise. That is the law now. But Dr. King says in this letter that just because something is the law does not make it right. So in this context, we have to figure out how to build a movement that can change an unjust law. Because the law of the land, the Supreme Court of this land, has just ruled against democracy. And if we're going to get any of the things we're talking about, we've got to have an expanded democracy. So I just think this is where we are right now. To read the letter in this present moment, we got to take this fact seriously. And it's going to take some real movement. But of course, we got good lawyers here like April and others. We got folks who've got to pursue this in the federal court. But also, there's got to be a movement, right? And there may need to be some direct action. I'm not exactly sure where it needs to be focused at the moment. We got to figure this thing out. This is the conversation I want to have around this letter. Where can we take action to really challenge and expose the violence of this anti-democracy movement.
Amen.
Because it's real as the segregationist violence was when King was writing.
And if I could say something here, I would love for us to recognize that we've got to be honest in these days about what we're seeing, because for far too often when we get engaged in political discourse, we suggest that there is an equal moral or amoral status for different political positions, and that the D's think this and the R's think this. We've got to begin to call out ultra-conservative politics as what it really is, an attempt to engage in supremacist policies, an attempt to maintain an unjust system and an unjust status quo, and an attempt to undermine the potential for justice. I love what Greer said a while ago about some of these things that Dr. King said were aspirational. He might have been fibbing just a bit when he said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all human beings are created equal. That meant me too. No, he knew that that didn't mean him too. But if we were to be the kind of nation that we used our exceptionist mythology to suggest that we were, then his calling it out meant that we had to reflect on that and transform and become that. We've got to begin to call out with a truth what it is that we see and how far we are from that, those aspirational ideals that we think make us exceptional.
Thank you all. This next question kind of feeds directly into what you all have been saying, especially Dr. Wilson Hartgrove, about that the rich conversation that we need to have about what's going on. And so this question reads, can you talk about the parallels to today in 1, cities creating laws to arrest protesters, and 2, the use of propaganda to distort history and the truth, and Socrates and MLK creating the necessary tension so that individuals could rise from bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal of racism?
Yeah, I can hop in here. That's a quote, a quotation from the MLK letter. I think that's a great question, or a set of questions. I'll tackle the first one first. And I do want to also tie my answer into a response to all of the great points that Dr. Wilson Hartgrove just made. But yes, there are many parallels today, if not what my AAAD, again, African American and Diaspora Studies professor at UNC said, that history may not always repeat itself, but so often it rhymes. I think we're in a time of rhyming right now. I mean, I protested, of course, after the 2018 Parkland school shooting in support of stricter gun control laws, but also after the George Floyd murder in 2020, where young people were really leading movements for police accountability across the United States. And that was a very much generational, it was a quite mixed crowd that was out there doing that. And we've seen some of the pushback to those types of acts of civil disobedience. So I think there are many parallels from the letter and the issues that Dr. King faced personally and also wrote about to today, including in North Carolina, where they've upped the felony charge to a rioting charge for those they deem to be acting unlawfully during times of protest. I think that's going to I know it's going to disproportionately impact protesters of color. And that's something that more conservative politicians really championed as a way to, again, resist this systemic effort or attempt to actually hold police officers accountable. I mean, there's just so much to really consider. And that's why I think education and conversation is important, that we get these ideas out there, but from a position, again, of humility, of I don't know everything. How can we work toward a solution that we can actually turn into a policy and write down so that equity and justice are sustained? And so that leads me into the second part of that question, is the use of propaganda these days to distort history and the truth, and kind of this crossover connection between Socrates and Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, in this day and age, when we just can't even have honest conversations with people about race or about healthcare or about the environment because people don't believe climate change exists, and on and on. It is tough and it's difficult, but I think it's necessary for us to persist. And again, to remain humble, but to also know when we are right, to know that facts are facts. And even when people start talking about race or biases, we know that those things are actually proven by facts in this country. The marginalization is backed by statistics. statistical data, excuse me, in this nation. And so I think the use of propaganda to distort history, and Dr. Sadler kind of touched on critical race theory, which is a whole nother conversation earlier. It's real. I mean, we're out here talking about Mickey Mouse and such when folks have actual real life issues and are not able to access the care they need. So I think that that quote, kind of wrapping up, so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal. I think that's a great, I can't see the name right now, but I think that's a great point from the person who brought that up. And there is a lot of research and a lot of scholarship out there that shows that Martin Luther King Jr., if he didn't pull from Socrates, they shared philosophical beliefs about a commission to a higher power, a belief in a higher power, and being concerned not only with the well-being of societies, but the spiritual and moral health of individuals. And so I think that when you think about this letter and this kind of response or rebuttal to the clergy of Birmingham and how Socrates was often responding to the citizens of Athens, there is a crossover connection, as I mentioned, and I think it's another symbol of the way that history is connected to the present. And so it's up to us to continue to move forward with persistence and confidence, but also humility and with data. I think people, maybe not as much as they should, but they often do respond to data. So coming up with those facts and being able to say, hey, don't just take it from me. Here's some qualitative data, some actual lived life experiences and stories, but also quantitative data could help as we move toward this vision that Dr. King had for justice and equity.
Thank you, Mr. Webb. We've got a few more minutes. Did any of the other panelists want to respond to that specific question?
I'll say quickly, as you're suggesting, you know, truth in a time of lies is a revolutionary act. So telling the truth is always important. And propaganda is not new. I think we should remember that. I mean, if you just study the history of North Carolina, our still state newspaper repented a century after the fact about the fact that it was actively engaged in the propaganda that brought down Reconstruction in the state. Literally publishing made up stories about, you know, these imaginary African Americans who were ravaging white women in other parts of the state. And, you know, they if you go back and study them, they would intentionally publish those in places, you know, away from where the story was about, because nobody ever actually knew who it really was. It was just the, you know, the power of the myth. And so, well, you know, we've got some crazy stuff on the internet. We got some crazy stuff that gets even pushed through state houses these days, but propaganda is not new. There has always been, there have always been ways of sustaining inequality through the repetition of myths. And like you were suggesting, the myths even rhyme when you pay attention to them across different eras.
Mm-hmm. Well, we only have a few minutes left. I just want to say a couple of closing remarks. So, and observations. One of the things, Dr. Manigault, Brian, that you were sharing, that you first read the letter when you were in college, and that's true of so many of us. Dr. Sadler put in the chat that a friend of his on Facebook has recommended that this letter be read like every year. And when we think about, we've talked about the efforts to suppress education. How do we're not going to be able to, of course, answer it now because we're running short on time, but just for us to consider, how do we make sure that we continue to educate all of us, right? So of the people who are on the call, how many of you have read